The book of Exodus is about the collision and collaboration between humanity and divinity. That's very much true in the story itself, but it's also true in the story surrounding the book. Let me explain. To do that, let's talk a little bit about the historical background of the book of Exodus. Anytime you approach a book of the Bible, it's really helpful to investigate things like when was it written and who wrote it. With Exodus, those questions are really complicated because the book, as we have it today, shows signs of being written or edited over a long period of time. Let me explain what I mean. First, let's establish when the book is supposed to be happening, the setting of the actual story. There aren't any specific dates given in the text that we can draw definitive clues from. On top of that, there are no external sources, either in extra biblical writings or archaeological finds that corroborate the events described in Exodus, at least not in as nearly as high detail as is described in Exodus. There are bits and fragments of clues that suggest something like the Exodus happened, and therefore the story is plausible. But there isn't any definitive proof that would help us kind of hone in on exact circumstances or dates. So our best guess is that the Exodus takes place sometime in the 13th century BC. So sometime between 1299 and 1200 BC. But here's where things get a little weird. Hebrew, like any language, changes and evolves over time. So linguistically, we can tell that the general period of a time that a piece of Hebrew writing came from. And the language in the book of Exodus, as we have it today, reflects Hebrew from the 7th century BC. That's pretty far removed from the time that the story is supposed to be written in. So attempting to claim from a linguistic standpoint that the book is from the 13th century BC would be like someone claiming a Harry Potter novel was brought over with Christopher Columbus. The time periods just do not match up. But what's even more odd is while the majority of the book reflects a much younger Hebrew, there's a section of the book that is really old. This is a song or poem sung or chanted in chapter 15 by Moses and the people after they crossed the Red Sea. It reflects much older Hebrew, potentially as old as the 13th century. This would be like, again, reading a Harry Potter novel and suddenly one of the chapters in the middle of the book flips into Old English. I don't know if you've ever tried to read Old English, but like English from the 1300s, it's another language. Might as well be. At the beginning of this year, I read a short story called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, there's a movie that just came out with the same title, but it's really awful. I'm not talking about the movie. What I'm talking about is a short story that was written in the 1300s, but wasn't discovered until 1839. It was just sitting in this drawer for hundreds of years, which is crazy. Anyway, the version of the book that I read has the original text on the left side of the page with the modern translation on the right side of the page, so you can see how the two fit together. And I have to tell you, Old English might as well be not English at all. No one who wanted a contemporary audience to understand a story would choose to write a chapter in the middle of it in Old English. But that's essentially what we have going on in the Exodus. So what's happening here? There's no consensus among scholars about what this all means. But I think there are some interesting things to note about all of this. First off, most early stories from the Bible were handed down orally, not written. It's possible that the story of Exodus wasn't written down completely for several hundred years and would therefore be written in a language much younger than the actual story. Secondly, humans have updated and translated and rewritten older works into modern languages, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, to make them readable for contemporary audiences. We do this with the Bible all the time. There are so many different translations of the Bible. Just think about the difference between the King James translation and the Message. They're almost completely different things. So it's not all that odd that the language from Exodus, as we have it today, reflects a Hebrew that is younger than when the story was supposed to have taken place. It's not unthinkable that the story was updated into modern Hebrew to make it more understandable for that contemporary audience, right? But then, why is this one section, this song or poem in chapter 15, not updated? Well, that's the funny thing about songs and poems. When you try to change the language of this kind of writing, you often mess it up. The metering, the pacing, the rhyming, you ruin the beauty. You ruin the beauty there because it's all dependent on the original wording and structure. On top of that, the song or poem would have been recited by the people several times a year for hundreds of years, as it still is today. It would have been so incredibly familiar to everyone that updating it not only was needless, but it would have rendered this extremely familiar, extremely orienting song into something unrecognizable. Whatever the case, if nothing else, this section of Exodus proves that some older version of the story existed hundreds of years earlier than the language reflected throughout most of the book as we have it today. Does any of this ultimately matter? I don't know. But to me, it makes this masterpiece all the more beautiful. The book of Exodus is very much about humanity and divinity colliding and collaborating. That's true in the story of itself, and it's also true of the story surrounding the book. The way this book has been handed down throughout time, its history reflects a very human process of transmission over thousands of years, while the content inside reflects a very divine truth about a God who sees and saves. A divine truth that's continually captivated and inspired humans over thousands of years. Truly, humanity and divinity colliding.